With Professor Douglas Torgerson on this occasion, who's written an impressive work on Harold Lasswell, who is the topic for us today, so-called father of our field. That's a kind of mixed observation for people in critical policy studies. But that's the point of Doug's book, is to try to suggest that he was a critical policy analyst, theorist, theorist. So Doug is professor emeritus of politics at Trent University in Canada. That's sort of near Toronto, but once you get to Toronto, you got 3 hours to go. Frozen tundra. There he was director of the Administrative and Policy Studies program, director of the Center for the Study of Theory, Culture, and Politics. His publications are fairly wide-ranging, but they include, in particular, in addition to Lasswell, which I guess Doug's been working on since I met him probably in the 1970s in a restaurant, I think in Chicago, where he tried to convince me that I should pay more attention to Lasswell, whose book he found in a secondhand bookshop somewhere, but he can tell us about that. But anyway, he edited an influential book with Bob Pelkey called Managing Administrative State, which was an important book back then in the development of environmental politics. Also significant is his book on the promise of green politics, environmentalism, and the public sphere. He's been a co-editor of the Handbook of Critical Policy Studies and also of the forthcoming Interpretive Policy Analysis book that we are doing. Sibylla is also a co-editor. Interpretive Policy Analysis, Meaning and Context. He's been an editor of Policy Sciences. I remember back then, he didn't want to do it, but we told him that if one of us had the chance to edit Policy Sciences, he had no chance of turning it down. And he did this, and it was the 1 or 2 years, I forget how long, where the issues were really more interesting, the essays. He has long worked between political theory and public policy, which I would say is not uncommon to many people who are in the critical policy studies movement. He began that work as a student at Berkeley and finished his PhD at the University of Toronto. I think those are the main points. And I would, at this point, turn it over to Doug.
Hello. Here is the cover of the book we're going to discuss today: Policy Sciences of Harold Lasswell, Contextual Orientation, and the Critical Dimension. An important part of the book's cover is it presents a striking photo portrait of Harold Lasswell taken in 1935 when he was 33 years old. He was born in 1902 and died in 1978. So moving on now to introduce our discussion of the book, we need to ask three questions. Who was Harold Lasswell? Why was he important? Why has he been revived? The answer to none of those questions is especially easy. First, who was Harold Lasswell? Harold Lasswell was something of a legend in his own time, regarded by many as the outstanding political scientist of his day. He actually transcended the disciplines to such an extent that he has been called a one-man university. Raised by intellectually engaged parents in small-town rural Illinois, he was nonetheless located a distance accessible to Chicago. Recognized as a prodigy while in high school, Lasswell was afforded the opportunity of meeting with John Dewey, with whom he had an extended conversation in Chicago at the time. Dewey remained a central influence on Lasswell throughout his career. Lasswell attended the University of Chicago on a scholarship and in 1922 received a PhD, a special bachelor's research degree for which he concentrated on economics and philosophy. In 1926, he received his PhD in political science at Chicago under his mentor, Charles Merriam, who was recognized as the chief of the Chicago School of Political Science, as it became famously known. Second, why was Lasswell important? During his lifetime, sympathetic observers have maintained it was beyond doubt that Lasswell was an omnipresence as the most original and eminent of political scientists. However, Lasswell's importance went beyond his proposal for the policy sciences, which from the early 1950s on developed as the culmination of his life's work. During his lifetime, he attracted a substantial range of allies and followers, and he could foresee the policy sciences emerging as a central focus in the social sciences. That did not happen. But the emergence of scholars and institutions devoted to the policy sciences, institutions such as the journal Policy Sciences, which he inspired, established a legacy that has lasted, although diminished from before. Lasswellians, both then and now, have been and are devoted students of Lasswell's texts and ideas. This expertise makes Lasswellians an important resource in understanding Lasswell, but the book indicates that this is but one step in understanding Lasswell and his importance. Why, third, has Lasswell been revived? The very idea of revival implies that Lasswell's influence has become, at best, moribund. Allies, followers, and critics alike have indeed noted a marked decline in Lasswell's influence since his passing in 1978, and allies have spoken of his now neglected agenda. Similarly, there has been substantial concern among allies and followers that the sustainability of Lasswell's policy sciences is tenuous, especially given generational change, as the number of those who have worked directly with Lasswell or with Lasswell's students diminishes. So, why has Lasswell been revived? It is certainly not the doing of Lasswellians. In effect, they have instead expressed concern that the Lasswellian movement itself is dying out. So the interest in reviving Lasswell comes from elsewhere. There have been recent interests coming from different sources that appear unconnected. Yet a principal source of renewed interest is critical policy studies. That is the kind of interest in Lasswell that informs the book. The shadow of old academic conflicts, especially in political science, haunts any effort, though, to come to terms with Lasswell in a way that would help advance the agenda of critical policy studies. The strategy of the book is to set these conflicts aside as potentially misleading, and thus circumvent distractions about Lasswell as a person in order to grasp the implications and ramifications of his ideas. Clearly, Lasswell's proposal for the policy sciences involves the most comprehensive framework for the policy field ever crafted. It presents a model addressing the full range of considerations pertinent to an effort to comprehensively apprehend and convey all the dimensions involved in orienting the social sciences to policy. Central to this framework is Lasswell's remarkable focus on context. The key question then is this: what are the implications and ramifications of Lasswell's idea of context for the development of critical policy studies? That question leads us to focus on the importance of Lasswell's proposal for contextual orientation. Its ramifications open onto a critical dimension, which could be obscured by focusing on Lasswell as a person. What we advance here by looking to Lasswell's idea of contextual orientation is the conclusion that attention to this critical idea is pertinent to the development of critical policy studies. We also conclude that thought through, the idea of contextual orientation leads not only to what Lasswell called the policy sciences of democracy, but to the potential for the policy sciences of radical democracy. And this is my first slide. I understand you can see me and the slide as well, I hope. So we must, as part of our study, expose ourselves to ourselves. Now, that's what Lasswell said in 1924. And doing so, he was summing up what he would later name his contextual principle. The principle, that is at the heart of his proposal for the policy sciences. The contextual principle found expression in what Lasswell later went on to propose, which were projects of contextual mapping, collective as well as individual. These were to be used to enhance and render explicit what everyone shares. That is, an at least implicit image of self in context. Lasswell's challenge to inquirers was to identify, question, revise, and develop that image as part of an explicit and enhanced contextual orientation. The focus of this book is on working out the implications of the contextual principle. That is to say, of the idea of the contextual principle. The reason for saying this is to avoid any misunderstanding of this point, that the book's focus is on the ramifications of that idea. The focus is not on what Lasswell may or may not have personally experienced. The focus is not about what he intended or what moved him. The point is to unpack the implications of the idea. So here the whole question of Lasswell's intentions, though not entirely ignored, is distinctly marginalized. My approach here is an adaptation of the Frankfurt School's method of immanent critique. Another way of saying this is the book is not a biography. In fact, It is pretty much the opposite of a biography or intellectual biography, for which a consideration of Lasswell's personal feelings and inclinations would be indispensable, even inescapable. I wrote the book documenting many important yet obscure details in hope that they might be helpful to a potential biographer or biographers. In fact, Andrew Willard, an amiable Lasswellian, who did much to help shape this book, he and I are in fact looking for someone who might be able to write such a book. So that's the basic thing I have to say about the book. But beyond that, the book has a hero who is not Lasswell. And I don't know whether this will be familiar, this is obvious to everyone or not. Do I need to? Anyhow, the name of this hero is Polly Murray. Has anybody heard that name? Okay, that means you haven't read the last chapter. So anyhow, the Polly Murray is an extremely important figure, but extremely unknown. For those who have access to Amazon Prime, which is the only way you can see this film, it's called My Name is Polly Murray. So the basic point about her in this context has to do with the book, The Sharing of Power in a Psychiatric Hospital, which I use as demonstrating a bottom-up potential in Lasswell. However, that potential, if you look at Polly Murray, whom he undoubtedly was aware was at Yale while he was there, she was doing her doctorate. For Polly Murray, Lasswell would be not fulfilling what he should do. That is to say, Lasswell said, what happens with this bottom-up upsurge of social movements is a change in attitudes. Well, Polly Murray would say, no, we want a change in attitudes, but we also want a change in the law. We want a change in policy. She was a lawyer, and she was one of the most important lawyers of the time, though she was very much unknown. So that is the direction I see the book going in, and it relates to the question of democracy. The threat of authoritarian populism, I argue in the book, means there is a necessary commitment in principle to democracy for all forms of policy research. The book is also about the past and the future, and in that sense, Lasswell's idea of the developmental construct, which we can discuss, which is a key aspect of contextual orientation, structures the book, including the Marx-inspired idea of the present as history. So this leads us into thinking about how, about the relationship, I would suggest, between theory and practice, which is a complicated topic that the book takes up. But essentially, for Lasswell, theory and practice were supposed to be united, and he took this inspiration both from Marx and pragmatism. So for my second slide, just briefly, emergence. These are the four phases I present in the book of Lasswell's development. The manifest Lasswell is particularly significant in phase 2, political psychiatry. But there is also a move from elitism to his democratic turn, as indicated in the next phases, particularly the science of democracy in 1940 to 1948. So I just wanted to put out, I'm not going to go in and explain this, but if you've looked at the book, you'll see this will be familiar, and that really structures my argument. Finally, the last slide is, I'm particularly putting this up here to see this photo of Lasswell, which was taken in 1935. And one reason I felt this was convenient for the book is 1935 was also the year in which he published his most important book, which was World Politics and Personal Insecurity, which, of course, drew attention to both the broad scope of world politics and the intimate realm of personal insecurity. This was part of his political psychiatry phase, but also this book places an emphasis on an act of creative orientation to context. Lasswell, in other words, sees creativity as needed in enhancing contextual orientation, and in this book, he emphasizes the open-ended nature of contextual orientation as a process and a practice. So I'm open to questions or what responses.
Or I'd begin by saying that I was never convinced. I told this Doug many times. I think Doug would say, agree with this, that there are two Lasswells, but in my view, it suggests that he didn't actually understand himself in the phrase, know yourself, because on the one hand, we have the man who was the behavioral political scientist, strong figure in promoting a form of positivism. And then we have, on the other hand, the man who promotes the policy sciences of democracy, which is Doug's focus. And he clearly shows that Doug clearly shows that there are important elements there that can draw this on. But for me, he never saw or was never willing to figure out how to connect these two. They stand apart. And this is the conflict. For me, I think that the people who find him elitist, like James Farr, have as strong an argument as those who find him as Democrat. They point to the behavioral thing, but also to his work with the military, the pictures of him standing there with General Eisenhower. And I always thought that he was a guy that wanted to be everything to everybody. He was a kind of Renaissance man, no doubt about this. But in doing that, he left a lot of threads, loose threads. Rosanna.
Can I respond, or somebody else want to respond? Well,
let's have the discussants first.
Yeah, well, just briefly, I would just say that that's the reason why I'm trying to get someone to write a biography.
That would depend on who wrote the biography.
Considerations are important to a biography, not my book. My book is an imminent critique. It doesn't matter what Lasswell thought, what he felt. What matters are the implications of the idea.
Right. For your book, but not for those of us who are interested in Lasswell as a figure in the field.
Not for those who are interested not for those who are interested in a biography. That is the task of a biography. It's not the task of what I did, which was trying to.
I'm not criticizing. What you did is okay, but I'm talking. The idea is that we're going to talk not just about your book, but about Lasswell as well. And the book is a springboard for the general topic.
Yeah.
About Lasswell.
And I could see. I hope more than one biography is written, and that's it's a tragedy, I think, that there's not a good biography of Lasswell. But we could get different biographies giving different interpretations of Lasswell.
Right. I'm a discussant, and I offered my interpretation. Philippe, right. Or Rosanna.
Okay.
Or Sibylla.
Thank you, Doug. Is it okay? You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks. So I'm a little sorry because we have not the opportunity to read the book, unfortunately. But I hope we will have, and I'm sure it will be very interesting. So maybe what is a little complex with Lasswell is, as you mentioned, there is a lot of phase. It's a curious man, and who have a lot of influence, and I think it's something that very interesting to observe. So I saw a kind of fascination, specifically in US, about Lasswell more than everywhere. What I would like to ask you is to because so I understand your idea that the question is not to speak about Lasswell, about his idea, but if we want to speak about the idea, we need to speak about the different book. There is no. Do you think that there is a major book of Lasswell? I mean that the Policy Science is a collective book when we have made an introduction. There is one. My impression is one of the most important book was the book was he written first before the Second World War with in 1936, 1935 about propaganda, about politics, and also the one with Kaplan, what I think is probably a major book. But I would like to have your view about this, because if we want to discuss about to go out of this ambiguity of Lasswell, which I totally agree with Frank, because for me it's a complex guy with different face. Something was interesting. I'm interested by the book of with Kaplan Kaplan. I don't know how you say
Kaplan,
that.
yes.
But it's very a pragmatist book because Kaplan was really pragmatist with the influence of Dewey. And there is some book I saw an article when he answered to in a debate when he said, "Well, science is something more strong." So contextual, you focus on the contextual, but it's probably the context is not enough to go in critical. So I would like to hear about you about what for you what is the major return of Lasswell in his different part of his life to really understand what he would like to say more than who we are. Okay, but we don't need to know who we are, but if we want to discuss about his idea, we need to discuss about his book or his article. What you consider about this?
Let's take comments
Maybe
first from the others. Otherwise,
yeah,
we'll run out of time for them. Rosanna? You had your
yeah.
hand up.
Also, yeah. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to listen to you, Doug. I already know some parts of your book because you sent to me, and so I'd like to talk about the importance of talking to Lasso again, about Lasso again. No, and so what does it mean for us in critical policy studies? No, to say that Lasso has a critical dimension. No, it's important for what? Personally, I think that the most important features in the field comes from this bifurcation, no, this kind of a double sense or double activity in Lasswell's agenda, as Philippe brought to the fore some years ago. But I think that it's special with regard to his incomplete discussion on democracy and especially on values, no? But what do you think about this? It is important for us in this moment discuss Lasso because we can see other things that you cannot see before. What is exactly what we can gain in terms of discussion for critical policy studies? We can see the crisis for example, in the policy field, looking back to Lasso. What is exactly the contribution? I know, but I'd like to, because I read your book, but I'd like to hear from you this. Thank you.
Thank
So
you,
maybe
Rosanna.
there is a new agenda about Laos.
Bill.
Are there others or?
Yeah, Sibylle.
Yeah, it's me actually, because, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on this Zoom meeting. Luckily, I had a chance to read the book beforehand, so I'm maybe going to introduce some more context, as it were, for those who didn't have a chance to read it. So I enjoyed when Frank said how Doug has been trying to convince him to pay more attention to Lasswell for decades, basically, and I was trying to reconstruct what I know about Harold Lasswell as someone who was trained as a political scientist in the 90s, if it wasn't for Doug, for instance, or other members of the critical policy studies community. And to be honest, it wouldn't be very much. I would probably know that he's the founding father of policy studies, his famous notions of politics, who gets what, when, and how, and perhaps also his idea of the policy process as this chain of logical phases. So having said that, the most things I know about Lasswell, I know from this kind of critical perspective. And nevertheless, I think I learned a lot of things in reading Doug's recent book, and I would like to highlight two aspects that I liked in particular. Maybe to pick up what Doug mentioned earlier, it's not an autobiography, and he doesn't necessarily follow these different phases of Lasswell's work that were already published in 1950 by David Easton, and this article about how there are two phases in Lasswell's thinking about values in relation to a democratic community. So, like Doug just stressed, instead, he takes this approach where he distinguishes between a latent and a manifest Lasswell, something I liked a lot, and how this latter is conceived then as the critical Lasswell. And key to recognizing the critical Lasswell is his concept of contextual orientation. And I would like to focus first on this contextual orientation because it was a bit of an eye-opener for me, and second on the role of symbols, because like Doug already mentioned, what he proposes in his book is a kind of immanent critique. So he kind of approaches Lasswell with his own weapons, as it were. So first of all, by mapping the emerging trajectory of Lasswell's work through changing cultural and historical contexts, and secondly, by questioning the symbols that Lasswell deploys in naming and framing policy sciences. So I like this approach of an immanent critique because I think what becomes very clear is how Doug is able to reconstruct these very various influences for an author that has been called as highly eclecticistic. So talking about this contextual orientation, and Doug already started his presentation with this quote, this call upon inquirers to expose themselves to themselves. And I found this really striking because I'm under the impression that, at least in my field of studies, that is maybe interpretive policy analysis of migration policy making in a European context, when we talk about context, we very often treat it as the background of our object of study. So we analyze meaning making in context, we analyze interpretations arising from lived experience in different contexts of organizations, polities, communities. We try to understand, we attempt at verstehen, to make clear people's interpretations of their own and others' experience in certain contexts, leading to context-specific meanings. And I'm very much aware that I'm not doing justice at all to all those colleagues who have written about positionality and reflexivity, but at least in my field of study, it seems to me as if this context orientation is always understood as there's the context for what we observe in terms of meaning making out there, rather than asking about our own context or making our own context transparent. For instance, in this field of migration policy studies, there has been a kind of reflexive turn that has been around for maybe 15 years and not much longer, where colleagues try to scrutinize our own knowledge production, how knowledge on migration produces a kind of methodological nationalism, how knowledge is produced, circulated, utilized by policymakers, etc. So I was a bit humbled to learn that this notion of reflexivity has been around for 100 years, as we have just seen on Doug's slide. And secondly, and I'm going to conclude with that short observation, I also very much liked how Doug draws from symbols, given that symbols were so important to Lasswell, with his understanding of symbols being whatever has meaning or significance in any sense. And just like with context, it seems to me that in our own empirical work, we try to detect symbols or interpret them in our object or subject of study. And I really like this twist where Doug suggests addressing Lasswell's own framework, not as a theoretical concept that is then very coherent, very consistent, etc., but to treat this own very particular style of Lasswell as a kind of symbolism in itself. So I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. I want to take just one quick privilege before we turn to Doug and say that it's not surprising that somebody who studied in the 1990s didn't know much about Lasswell, because somebody who studied in the US in the 1970s didn't know anything about Lasswell. Lasswell, even though he became a president of the Political Science Association, disappeared from political science. Mm-hmm. He was a kind of footnote, but nobody talked about him. So when he came back with a kind of surge of the policy studies field.
I also had a chance to read the whole books, and that's why I'm a bit, have a very strong feeling to share, to discuss with you today as the author of the book. I think it's very important and it's mean a lot to the critical policy communities when you say that the founder of the field also focus on critical and interpretive orientation of policy studies. I think that, for us can endorse and legitimize the way that we are trying to do to promote the critical and interpretive policy studies and analysis. And with that, you already show how he promote the radical democracy, how he engage with the symbol and interpretive methods. I think it's very important. And with that, it is the time that we can shift from the fringe of the field to the central of the field by tracing back and reframe the way that we're talking about critical. It's not just happen, but actually it's start from the beginning, very beginning, and it is the part of the DNA of the founder of the field. Yeah, that's what I feel.
Yes, but I would say that this is what Doug's done is extremely important in just this regard, because the Lasswell orientation, grounded in the Policy Sciences Journal, is the more or less, I would say, the non-critical policy studies orientation. But what Doug shows is that we have an opportunity to build out from that other Lasswell. So that's a really important significance, I think, of this book. Professor Torgerson, would you like to reply?
Yes, thank you, Frank. Thanks for all these comments. I can't say that I can hold them all within my brain, but I appreciate them. the thing about Lasswell, I would say, is that there is a critical dimension to Lasswell. And I wouldn't say that Lasswell was altogether critical. There was a critical dimension to Lasswell. We can perceive a critical Lasswell. And that's the Lasswell that's emerging, whether he's aware of it or not. And what that shows us is the logic of the argument is what's important. Whether Lasswell understood it or not doesn't really matter for us, because we can see that whatever his intention was, he was propelled in a direction of radical democracy. Once he started along that line, you can't stop conceptually. And so that's the basic point I'm trying to make, is that Lasswell for us is not the Lasswell who might have said this or that said that, who did his marathon talk, which I think Frank has once said to me, is people who talk like that on and on and on are all about themselves. And so we're suspicious of Lasswell in that respect. I've got to, I would be interested in different biographies, but for us, we don't need a biography first. We just need to be able to see where the logic of the contextual principle takes us.
That's not entirely the case, I would say, Doug, because we are in a sort of battle with the other Lasswell, the other people who say they own Lasswell, the policy, science, journal movement, and so forth.
Well,
I take your point, though.
Well, the thing is that I got, people said I knew a lot about Lasswell before I started this book. I knew nothing. And what I really learned a lot with was engaging with Lasswellians who knew the thing backwards, knew Lasswell backward and forward. And I had to reread Lasswell and learn it as well as they did. And I hope better. But anyhow, Lasswell is, I think, could be important to how we see what we're doing in critical policy studies. And I would also mention that there are, go ahead. I probably said enough.
Pascal, Thomas, Olga, you want to add anything? Feel free if you do. Rosanna?
So no, I'd like to highlight one thing, Douglas. The fact that you, after so many years, though insisting in Lasswell, you really managed to place Lasswell as object of a new agenda. I can see perfectly that there is a new agenda on Lasswell. There are new books, articles, new researchers, new scholars interested in Lasswell, and exactly try to clear the dust on Lasswell, over Lasswell, see new aspects, research into his other less obvious influences. And for me, this seems fantastic. Because as Elau said in 1999, I think, there was a neglected agenda on Lasswell. And now the scene has changed, because there are a lot of people started to talk about Lasswell again and try to explain, and that was my question to you, why it's important to look back to the beginnings of the policy field and look again Lasswell, and now you come to you bring to us this with a very great deep discussion about the critical dimension on Lasswell, but trying to discuss more specifically about the context. That means if we look at the context, we can see other things on Lasswell. But the fact is, for many years, when scholars look to Lasswell, they cannot see this contextual dimension, this contextual implication. And so Lasswell was considered for many as a very mainstream scholar, of mainstream researcher. What do you think about this now? Do you think that we are facing a new agenda on Lasswell, and this is really, it's part of you, it's because of you, but how can you see this new agenda? No? There is this new agenda, and if there is this new agenda, for you, what does it mean?
Well,
Sibylla had their hand up at the same time, so let's.
No,
wanna
maybe
jump in?
Doug can answer
I'll
first, and then
forget what I'm
going
going to say. Can I just, one thing, I had to laugh almost had to laugh when Frank said that I kept on trying to get him to pay more attention to Lasswell. Well, he's the one who kept after me, wanting me to publish things on Lasswell all the time. And this book would not exist if it weren't for Frank, because he's the guy who got me to write it. So thank you, Frank.
Well, I wanted you to prove to me that I should take him seriously.
Well,
You did.
I would say you don't have to take him seriously. Take his ideas seriously. And
Well, I have a different view of that, but that's okay. There's much in your book that's actually historical. It's not. It's true that you're focusing on developing this logic of the context, but the potential reader, should know that there's a lot of history in there. It's not a history book, but there's a lot about the background and the man. Sibylla.
Yeah, it was interesting to become an historian, really, writing this book. It was
well, you were an intellectual historian.
What's that? I'm sorry.
It was a work of intellectual history.
Yes, I agree.
Sibylla.
But Doug, maybe you want to answer Rosanna's question first. What about a future agenda?
Oh, a future agenda. I'm sorry. Yes. Well, the thing is that the last chapter is called Lasswell and the Critical Agenda. So I would say that the critical agenda already exists. What the thing is, what is the relationship of Lasswell to that agenda is the argument of the final chapter, and Polly Murray becomes a very important figure in that respect, because she really thought through. Polly Murray really radicalizes Lasswell's thinking.
Yeah, I also wanted to return to this historical perspective, because what I found really interesting in your book were some aspects where I felt, well, maybe it's not history repeating itself, but some observations of the historical context that really resonated. The one thing being this age of global insecurity, and the second, a discussion where you talk about the death of political theory, at least in a German academic context. That is something that we can observe firsthand, with a lot of chairs of political theory being turned into some more empirical professorships. But I wanted to ask a question, because you said when you started your research for this book, you realized how little you knew about Lasswell. Is there anything in particular where, from the point of view today, you would criticize your own writing on Lasswell, or certain perspectives that have changed over the course of writing this book?
I don't know. I'm too close to it, I think. But yeah, criticize my own approach.
I would say, Doug, your statement that you didn't know much about him was very modest, because in fact you've been focusing on him for a long time.
I know, but I didn't, there were things that I frankly hadn't read and things I hadn't read well enough. And going back into it, things opened up in a way that I just would not have imagined. And also dealing with Lasswellians directly about what I was writing was a big eye opener. There was a lot of resistance, particularly on the part of Andrew Willard. But he came around. He came around, one step at a time, but finally he grasped it. And
you need to clarify that he's one of the Lasswell gatekeepers
for
policy sciences.
I suppose there will be a symposium in policy sciences where Bill Asher will be one of the discussants, a number of others. Farr will be a discussant. So we'll see how things go when I do that. They'll write something, I'll write a response.
Well, those guys, I mean, they have a Lasswell Society.
Yes, Society of Policy Sciences.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, independent of the journal.
Well,
Comes out of it.
The journal is published by the Society of Policy Sciences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Philippe, Pierpont, Pascal, Olga. What comes to mind?
Luke, what do you think about the book of William Dunn, who was more or less about the beginning of the Lasswell understanding of pragmatism? What is how you link, how you read this book?
Yes, well, the phase one, intelligent social order, is in Lasswell's development, is the Deweyan phase. Dewey is a major influence on Lasswell early on. Lasswell, in fact, met Dewey when he was in high school for an extended discussion. It was prearranged, and when he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, Dewey was no longer there, but he would sometimes come and stay at the house of George Herbert Mead, where Lasswell would meet him there. So he was well acquainted with Dewey and Dewey's work, and this is the pragmatist dimension is understated by Farr, I believe, but I think that it can be seen if you look more carefully at that first phase. But definitely, Lasswell, there was a strong pragmatist dimension to it. One writer, I forget his name, he died recently, emphasized the role of pragmatism, but I think pragmatism is just one influence on Lasswell. Far more important are Freud and Marx.
That it was done, that Philippe was mentioning, who just died. Say something about why his colleagues at the University of Chicago refused to give him tenure. I think this had something to do with his pragmatic, they didn't accept his orientation.
He had tenure at the University of Chicago. He was not promoted to full professor. That was the problem. And the problem was the president of the university thought he was a dangerous man, a danger to democracy. And that was the reason. I forget his name, but he's the guy who established the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in California. I can't remember his name.
What was his argument? Why was he a danger to democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know, but I came across a letter once from him to Lasswell said, "You are a dangerous man." So
yeah, but there is another thing, Doug. Because I think I don't know exactly the story, but one thing is sure, and you can find in the Almond article about the end of the Chicago School of Political Science. I mean that all the people coming from Merriam was out at the University of Chicago after the Second World War, and it's not only Lasswell. And I think it's also something interesting is the link between Lasswell, Merriam, what we call the Chicago School of Political Science. And I understand that there is like some philosopher who arrive in the Chicago School who want to come back about, I don't remember the name of the guy, who play a very important influence to go out all generation of Merriam students. And it's not only personal, I understand, but I don't know. I don't know if you have the real story, but I think there is a context also, not
Yes,
to come back on the
there is.
contextual dimension.
Yeah, there are a couple of figures that were important, but the most famous, of course, was Herbert Simon, and that was
Right.
and that's where the pragmatism comes in with regard to Lasswell. I wrote to Herbert Simon once upon a time, and I said, "What about your relationship to Lasswell and pragmatism?" And he said, "I read all that stuff, but I became more interested in the more formalism of logical positivism, and particularly Carnap." So so we see in Simon, who I think is really an extraordinary thinker, but you need to read him through really imminent critique. But Herbert Simon is a major figure coming out of this, but he's also one with whom you can contrast Lasswell, because Herbert Simon is the technocrat. He's the most sophisticated technocrat, I think, there ever was, and Lasswell resisted that approach.
Thomas always has a question. What comes to mind, Thomas? I don't mean to put, if you don't have one, it's okay.
No, sorry, I'm just listening curiously, but I don't have a question at the moment. Thanks.
No, please.
I have another question with regards to pragmatism. Does either of you have any idea of why this overall pragmatist approach is so highly neglected in policy analysis these days? I mean, you mentioned some things of Simon changing tracks, etc., but speaking more generally, because I mean, you Doug, you make an effort of tracing these connections to Dewey in your book, but I mean, there must have been more, and in other disciplines plays such an important role until today. Why is that?
Well, yeah. Could you just repeat your question just briefly?
I was wondering why pragmatism doesn't play as big as a role as it could.
Oh, yes. Yes, well, I believe what happened in the development of American political science was a shift away from pragmatism towards positivism, and that, or at least a vague positivism, and that occurred in the post-war period when, well, actually around 1970, I think, was the is that about the right time? I think, yeah.
But see, I would argue that Lasswell was also, the other Lasswell was part of the guy who was pushing behavioralism, which became part of that movement. But when we come to pragmatism, we can turn to Philippe, who wanted to add something. Philippe?
No, I just think that there is an end of the pragmatism around the 1915 with the new movement of positivism, even from Lasswell. There is I can put also on a very interesting debate organized in 1945 with what is the name of the guy? It's between Lasswell, Simon, and a guy, the name is, sorry, I will find, Perez, about the role of the discourse and the semantic in the political science. I recommend this discussion between all, and you see that after the game theory and the book of Newman, and there is like a temptation, I think, that positivists can offer a new way of democracy, a new way of, and all these pragmatists disappear, I think, during 30 years. And this is how I understand it. It's there is like a paradigm or framework who changed after the Second World War. And even Lasswell contribute to this change. Even Simon. It's curious and paradoxical.
The third name?
Paris. I can give you also some. It's a very interesting debate. Let me give you on the.
It's if I could just. Are you speaking of semantics of political science in the American Political Science Review of 1950?
Let me.
It's a discussion of a book on language and politics or something like that.
Anybody else want to jump in here while we're?
Well, about that debate, the two key figures there in American Political Science Review, 1950, Semantics of Political Science, are Lasswell and Simon, and you can see the contrast between the two really stand out in that.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, I think you are rescuing Simon. Simon was said to be a very difficult man by his friends, and one problem is he never stopped talking, which drove a number of people crazy.
Yeah, well,
that's why he
General
produced so many things,
observations
no? A lot of books.
I mean, that's not unusual to academics. Rosanna.
So, Doug, if I'd like to insist in this idea of agenda, because we here have mentioned different works about Lasswell, no? And each one with a different way to interpret Lasswell. So if you talk about a new agenda, if you take in consideration the last 10 years, for example, no, with your book, the Dan's book, and the other, the Philip's book. And so we could say that there are 2 or 3 directions of research in this agenda. That means one is criticism, no? And I think that you are heading this direction, no? There are another one on pragmatism, and maybe Dan is another, good leader in this direction, and maybe another one about democracy, because there are other articles that are discussing if democracy was a central value on Lasswell, because there is a good question for me about the Lasswell work, that is when he talked about values, for example, no, where these values were produced, outside of the policy, that means in the politics, or inside of the policy. I think that maybe if you took in consideration the values, the question of values that was central in his work, and you take this as a category of analysis, we could organize his production in 3 or 4 different phases according to the meaning that he is giving to the notion of values, no? And so I'm insisting in this because I'm trying to organize a kind of overview about the current production about Lasswell. I think that we can maybe map this and try to give more consistency to this new agenda, to not lose again and again, this discussion. And so we need to retake this agenda, retake this agenda, I don't know, 5 or 6 years after this moment here. So I think that we could, all of us are more or less interested in Lasswell, no? And so maybe we could try to organize or just to reflect about this, what we are producing, what are the best direction or the main direction in this moment.
Well, I think
I would just say that I would just say that that's the question that I hope the book opens up. I leave the answer to that question to other people. I mean, I would engage with it, but that's the point that you're right. That's where the book goes, and that's where you're asking the right question. But I haven't written that book yet.
Well, I think Rosanna was making a plea for the rest of us. I wanted to make an additional point about the relevance of his interest in democracy early on in the fascist period that he experienced in Europe. Extending Sibylla's point about the relevance, we are now in a period where authoritarianism and some form of neo-fascism has returned, making the question ever more important.
Well, that is the reason why I argue that one cannot take for granted the liberal democratic context of policy work, and in fact, people on this panel who live in authoritarian countries, but in others who live in liberal democratic countries, but we can't take liberal democracy for granted. So that changes our agenda. That we have to figure out how to protect liberal democracy from the authoritarian threat. Because without liberal democracy, there's no chance for democracy. You know, that's I'm not saying that liberal democracy is the end is the best form, but it contains the
best we got.
Yeah, the best we got, and it's certainly to thwart the authoritarian threat, because the authoritarian threat is a threat to all forms of policy research. Because, as Lasswell said, democracy thrives on knowledge, authoritarianism thrives on ignorance.
But Philippe wants to say something, but I'm not sure I would quite put it that way, because policy research can actually be quite functional and serve Russia as well as a future, a more democratic version. Philippe.
Yeah. Two things. So the first one about the question of Rosanna. I identify in my mind at least 3 different ways that Lasswell used the concept of value, totally different epistemologic view. I mean that in the book of the politics, how, when, and how, it is very Weberian conception of value, where value is observed as neutral perspective to understand the conflict about value. And we don't forget that the main question of Lasswell at this moment, the very structuralist question, is how power use value to maintain it in its place. When you see the book with Kaplan, it's a very Dewey concept of value. It's a concept of valuation speak about. It's how there is a building of the value. And when you see policy science, and there is no question about how people use value. There is democracy, which is the beginning of the end of everything for what policy science need to do without question about political value. So I think there is, I think it's probably Lasswell is someone who is really absorbed a lot of things around him. But my impression first is really about this. And second, about the question you evoke. It's interesting to observe that what Seduk for me is what believed Lasswell during the Second World War. And when it changed, he'd say, oh, finally, a good policy with good knowledge stabilize democracy. And we know that now it's false in the sense that I remember when we was in Singapore would like to say how we can do a wonderful policy with a wonderful result better than any democracy, and we are not democracy. So the link between the performance and the knowledge about public policy and democracy is considered by the Lasswell of 1945 as something obvious, which is not the case in the Lasswell of 1935, because when there is probably also the context of Nazism who go out and propaganda, and you understand how the value is a play. And I think it's interesting to observe Lasswell in how we reflect part of this period.
Mm-hmm.
So I
I
don't
think
know.
we're over our time.
Right.
We could take another question or two, and Doug can certainly have a final word. Anybody else want to offer something at this moment?
Just wondering why the DNA of the Lasswell from the critical side has been lost in translation for so long until you found it. I mean, why a lot of people, he has a very important words, and a lot of people read his work, but end up with technocratic orientation. Why? I mean, critical side has been lost in translation.
So you're interested in why Lasswell? Formulate that question again. Why Lasswell?
Why no one see the critical side of Lasswell until you found it? I mean, a lot of people read his work and end up with the technocratic orientation.
I should say that John Dryzek also saw this critical side to Lasswell around the same time that I did. I'm sure we came up with it independently of one another, but he certainly saw the same thing. But why has that not been more broadly seen? Well, I would say simply because of all the things about Lasswell as a person. Again, that's the point. Lasswell as a person, the whole battles in political science and people, one camp versus another camp. You can't see Lasswell seriously if you're bound up in that. I mean, that's to say, you can't see Lasswell's ideas if you're bound up in that. And so it's that, I would say that's that battle that people want to argue about the corpse of Lasswell. I'm more interested in the body of his work.
Well, it's also true that political science, as Sibylla noted, has gone more quantitative, empirical, rational choice, and that plays into the other side of Lasswell. They're just not interested in that.
Well, Lasswell had those things were of marginal interest to Lasswell.
No, I'm talking about, the question was, why did other people not pick him up?
Oh, yeah. Well, they could, because Lasswell, the dimension of Lasswell that I see threatens the world of that kind of policy research.
Well, that's right. Actually, we could leave it right there. That's a good final note. Anybody wants to have one more observation on that? It's possible, but I would say then thank you for this stimulating discussion. We'll look forward to a more careful read of your book, Doug. Book reviews will be coming. And you mentioned a sort of roundtable discussion in policy sciences. I'd be very interested to see what those guys that have been lined up will have to say.
Me too.
Yes. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.